Welcome, everyone. My name is Marlon Footracer from the WWLP Institute. Thank you all for logging on to today's webinar, Strengthening Tribal Response to Violence Against Native Women. What we'll do here is I'll go ahead and give you all might be familiar with our format, but I'll give you a few housekeeping notes. Here we go. Number one, your control panel will appear on your user screen. All attendees will be muted during this presentation. Once you call into the meeting call line, you may enter your PIN. Use the questions box on your panel to submit questions and responses. During the discussion portion, please raise your hand by clicking the hand icon to signal to be unmuted. To minimize the control panel, use the orange arrow at the top left. Now, we'll turn the time over to the presenters.
Thank you, Marlon, and thank you to all of our participants who have joined us. We have registrants from all over Indian country, including urban areas, as well as some of our smaller nonprofit Native organizations. So welcome to all of you. I want to introduce myself, and I am going to talk a little bit about the program and introduce my colleague. Hamatakiapie, Lana Hunter Makiapie, Sisitawan Wakbetuan Mataha. My name is Lana Hunter, and I come from the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate Nation in Sisseton, South Dakota. And my father's people are from the Tlingit Nation in Southeast Alaska. I'm Raven Frog Kiksati, and I'm the Tribal Victim Resource Specialist for the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. I also manage this program, the Strengthening Tribal Response to Violence Against Native Women, with the Office on Violence Against Women and our partners who you see listed on the screen. We have several partners. Next slide. We have several partners who partner with us on this initiative, and they are located around the country but provide national tribal training and technical assistance. The Tribal Judicial Institute assists us with our tribal protection orders and providing tribal training and technical assistance on tribal protection orders for this initiative. We also work with the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center located in Fairbanks, Alaska, and they work with us on Alaska-specific and cultural materials, as well as outreach to the 230 tribes that are located in Alaska. We work also with the Alliance of Tribal Coalitions to End Violence, which is a consortium of 19 tribal coalitions located throughout the United States. And two of our partners who are with us are part of the Alliance of Tribal Coalitions, and I'll talk a little bit more about them. We also partner but also manage this grant through the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and we have several offices located throughout the United States, including here in Minnesota, where Bonnie and I, who will be presenting on here, reside out of. And then we also have a main office located in West Hollywood, California. The Tribal Response Initiative, as you see on your screen, is our logo of this initiative. We also partner with several other direct service providers. Next slide. The direct service providers assist us in looking over materials that we provide, as well as assist us in the direction and how we do outreach to tribes. And they are the Great Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, where they provide domestic violence, sexual assault, and they are one of the shelters in Oklahoma that provide services to Native women and children. We also partner with the Amonic Women's Shelter, which is located in Amonic, Alaska. And we also partner with the Native Alliance Against Violence, which is one of those 19 tribal coalitions located throughout the United States. Next slide. I wanted to just say quickly about this initiative that it is a partnership with the Office on Violence Against Women, and so our primary focus is safety. And we have a number of expertise on our staff as well as in our partnership that focus exclusively on safety for violence against Native women and children, as well as offender accountability. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Bonnie Clermont, who could introduce herself and her advocacy experience. Bonnie?
Thank you, Lana. My English name is Bonnie Clermont, as Lana said, and my Ho-Chunk name is Vajadanga, and that's to be called upon. I am a citizen of the Ho-Chunk Nation, and I live here in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I work for the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, along with Lana and our colleagues across the country. We have offices all over. We just want to welcome you all to the webinar, and I've been with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute for about 15 years as the Victim Advocacy Program Specialist, and prior to coming here, I worked as an advocate for many years, probably, 25 years or so, and that's my heart. That's where my passion is doing advocacy and helping tribes develop their responses to victims of all different types of violent crime that's happening across the country, including in Indian country. So that's what this initiative is focused on, because the Office on Violence Against Women fully realized and recognized that there are many tribal nations that don't have resources or lack resources, and also aren't receiving Office on Violence Against Women funding. And we're concerned about those tribal nations, which, I applaud their efforts. And we happen to receive the grant to work with tribes to help them respond to the increasing degree of violence that's happening to our Native women in particular. And yes, it can happen to men as well, but this particular, the Department of Justice focuses primarily on violence against Native women. So on your screen, you see some of the data that we use. And it's really significant in terms of when you look at the data and how frequent violence against women is happening in all its forms. 56.1% of American Indian Alaska Native women experience sexual violence in all its forms, and 55.5% have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner. So, even that alone tells us that, it's happening. When we look at the data, I always say, even if it's happening to one person, it's significant. But when we look at that, it's like well over half of our Native women are experiencing this violence. An estimated 24.5% of American Indian Alaska Native women have experienced stalking during their lifetime. And on some reservations in the U.S., the murder rate of Native women is 10 times higher than the rest of the nation. So I always say that when we look at the overall data on the frequency of violence against Native women, it's like Native women are the most often raped, the most often battered, the most often stalked, and even our adolescent women are experiencing dating violence. And that's also included with this initiative, is to help tribes develop their responses to dating violence that's happening in their communities. So this is an awesome opportunity for tribes to participate in, to receive training and technical assistance, tribes that do not receive Office on Violence Against Women funding. Forward. Turn it over to Lana. Lana, the initiative, I'll just talk about the initiative, which I love doing.
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry about that. So as Bonnie mentioned, this initiative is funded through the Office on Violence Against Women, and it's a new program that they've never done before. And as we think about the many tribes that we have, including some of the new tribes that have recently become tribes. We're looking at about 570 some tribes across the United States, and we estimate, at least as we were looking at numbers, that less than a third of the tribes receive Office on Violence Against Women funding. So this is an opportunity for tribes to receive no cost or free training and technical assistance in the specific areas that we will talk about during this webinar. So if you're tuned in today, we understand that you may need assistance, may want to request training and technical assistance, or may just need resources. If you want to take a look at our website, it is located on the screen at www.tribalresponse.org. And on there, we have a number of resources, manuals, books, booklets that I will talk a little bit about at the end of the webinar. But please visit our website just to see the types of training and technical assistance requests that you can make. We also are gearing up in 2020 to do regional training. So we will have trainings throughout the United States located in areas where there's a concentrated number of tribes that do not receive OVW funding. And so you can check our website, or we will send out an email so that you can learn more information about that. Next slide. So as we look at the capacity building, what we understand is that at least for the safety concerns for victims and their families, mainly women and children, what we understand is that some tribes may have a law enforcement response, but may not have an advocate response, or may have a tribal court response, but may not have effective law enforcement. So what we look at in capacity building training for tribes is to really look at all of the areas of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and teen dating violence, to really understand the breadth and depth of capacity that you have to respond. This is not an issue of safety that is left solely to a woman and her child to seek their own safety. This is really a community issue. And so we understand that there has to be a community response. And we do have resources to address how the community becomes involved in either holding offenders accountable or victim safety. When we look at reporting in communities, we don't necessarily think of reporting if there's low reporting. We don't necessarily think of that always as a good thing. Low reporting could mean that there are safety concerns that a victim may feel, and she's not able to report because there's no accountability for the offender, or there is, safety concerns for her in reporting. Maybe her, relative works at law enforcement. So we try to look at all of those issues. It doesn't happen in a vacuum, and this is really how we understand community responses to violence against Native women. And so we are able to utilize tools that we've developed through this grant, including a community assessment, just to look at what resources are available. We also do, I would say, kind of a question and answer, but I guess in the Western world, we would call it an intake form, just to understand what resources are available, if there are any funding resources that you currently are receiving. One of the questions that we have had is if you receive an OVC grant or Office on Victims of Crime grant, but you do not receive OVW funding, do you still qualify? And yes, you do. So this is exclusively to look at those tribes that do not receive OVW funding. So if you do receive OVC funding, we will still be able to work with you under the purpose areas of this grant. Next slide. So what is the cost of the training? Does this mean that if you receive OVW funding, can we work with you? I would say that if you do receive OVW funding, we can work with you in a limited capacity. We do have the training and technical assistance providers located throughout the United States, so we can still provide resources and information. However, to have on-site training and technical assistance and or training on site, you would have to qualify for this funding and training by not receiving OVW funding. Next slide. So this is an opportunity for us to talk about the very specific areas that we provide training and technical assistance in. As you can imagine, there is a plethora or a number of areas that we could provide training in. However, for the purposes of understanding the critical baseline safety needs for victims and offender accountability, we focused on 3 specific areas, which we will talk about, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Bonnie. Next slide.
Thank you, Lana. So one of those is helping tribes develop a coordinated community response. And historically, CCRs, I'll refer to them as CCRs, are teams that are organized and developed to address primarily domestic violence. So in any community, there could be various numbers of teams, right? Maybe a child protection team, a multidisciplinary team. And I think, I always say that the team approach, I think, is really rooted in a tribal traditional response, because that's how we addressed disasters, and when our villages were, during, like illnesses that came into our villages, or when our villages were attacked, or whatever it was. If it was a natural disaster, we pulled together. And our communities still do that, when there's major losses, or, people come together and help one another. And that's really the essence of a CCR, is looking at what's happening in the community around this issue of domestic violence in this situation, and, seeing the skills, bringing the skills to the table, and bringing the people that have those skills to the table, so that because oftentimes, tribal communities are really under-resourced, and coming together and pooling those resources are really important, are really critical when you look at addressing a problem that's so extensive as domestic violence, and how it impacts one person and the safety needs of that person, including that, especially if that person has children, that also includes the children and their safety needs. So it's looking at those, coming together as a team to look at those needs, as well as holding offenders accountable, because that's also really critical, a critical task of a coordinated community response. And a lot of tribes don't have CCRs, so this initiative is also designed to help tribes develop CCRs. And that's really one of the tasks of a CCR, is to come together and look at what is it that we have in our community, what kind of services exist, how are service providers working together rather than working in this more silo effect. How can we come together and communicate and collaborate with one another? So that's really at the essence of CCR development, and that's something that we can do. We can help. If your tribe doesn't have Office on Violence Against Women funding and you want to develop a CCR, that's something that we can help with. Forward. Forward. Nope. You're too far forward. What was that last one? Back? That one. Nope. Nope. You skipped it. There. Stop. So initiative partners with the CCR provide individualized training, technical assistance, and resources to help a tribe design and implement a CCR that addresses victim safety and offender accountability, like I said. And we would help do that as far as planning is concerned. So helping you look at, bringing together maybe a core team to begin to identify who do we want to invite to sit on a CCR, and also look at, the importance of engagement. How do we get community buy-in? How do we get stakeholder buy-in to, activate the CCR? So it's really brainstorming about who sees victims of domestic violence, who provides services to those individuals, which could be advocacy, which could be law enforcement, the courts, and other service providers as well. So brainstorming together and identifying who to invite to the table. And also our initiative will help look at development and implementation. Once you have that team, then to bring together and start identifying roles and responsibilities, being able to share across the table those roles and responsibilities, and develop protocols so that you're also looking at sustainability for your CCR to ensure that you do have policy and protocol from which to operate. And I'll also talk about a tribal sexual assault response team development that our initiative can also help tribes develop along with the implementation. And also, as part of that, I think in a lot of communities, it's the victim advocacy program that sort of spearheads this initiative or this plan to develop a CCR or a SART. So having a victim advocacy program, I think, is really important. And a lot of tribes don't have a tribally based victim advocacy program. So that's something we also can help you develop, and just do some training around what is advocacy and the importance of advocacy, the roles that they play, how they can coordinate a CCR and or a SART. And of course, we know that there's many different types of victim advocacy programs, the community-based type, but also the systems-based type that are operating out of U.S. Attorney's Office, for example, or out of law enforcement office. And I think the critical piece to developing any team approach is doing community education and awareness on the issue of domestic violence, sexual assault, whatever the team is focusing on, because that's where, this team is about the community. It's about keeping the community safe. It's about, educating the community about why domestic violence happens, why sexual assault happens, why stalking happens, and why dating violence happens. And that this team is really organized to address that, but also it's really critically important that a community isn't just operating from a sort of a Band-Aid approach, but really looking at some of the root causes of violence against Native women. So that's also something we can help through this initiative, is to provide tools and help you look at developing a community education and awareness campaign. Next slide. So this is like one of my favorite topics is tribal sexual assault response team development. And, if you're working with victims of sexual assault and cases surrounding sexual assault, we all know the challenges of that in terms of the jurisdictional boundaries and working with agencies that provide services from various jurisdictions, and to be able to bring them all to the table to increase victim safety and offender accountability can be a real task. And that's one of the things that this initiative can help Tribal Nation with, is to develop a SART along with, like I said, a coordinated community response. Next slide. So I want to just say a little bit about a SART. And having been a part of one here in my community and helping start our local SART, it's really, it's a lot of work, yes. But I think, when people understand the importance of a SART and how really it can increase victim safety and also even offender accountability, people come together, at the table and identify their commonality. And that's really victim safety. The safety of the community is a commonality, along with, people want to have, those that are harming others to take some responsibility and to have some ownership of that and to get some help so that it doesn't continue to happen. So a CCR and a SART really is that's the common thread that's woven throughout both of those teams. And it is multidisciplinary, and it can, again, that core team can sit down and brainstorm around who to invite to a CCR and or a SART. It's interagency, and along with that, it could be tribal organizations or agencies, departments, but it also can be non-tribal, because especially if there's jurisdictional differences, so if you have the federal jurisdiction, then you want to be able to work along with your federal partners at the table. So it would be really important to invite your local Assistant U.S. Attorney's Office, to invite the Bureau of Indian Affairs, law enforcement individuals, as well as your medical people, those that are providing forensic examinations, etc. And both of these are an intervention model. It's bringing awareness to the cases that are happening, being able to discuss them, of course, with the consent of the victims, that you may not be naming them in particular, but looking at particular cases and looking at how they're being, how they're operating through the system is really important, and where are the gaps, where are, cases falling through the cracks, and this is really one good way to do that. And it's a team approach to enable a team to implement comprehensive, sensitive, and a coordinated system of intervention and care for victims of sexual assault in this case. It can also be instrumental in developing policies and practices to hold offenders accountable, like I mentioned. And that's really important. It's like, where are the gaps in terms of, holding offenders accountable? Why is it that more aren't being held accountable? Why aren't there more charges that are happening in these cases? And why are there so much delays? And these are all things that can be brought to the team to talk about how can we address those. So a SART's focus is to implement a comprehensive, sensitive, coordinated system of intervention and care for sexual assault victims, and to potentially strengthen cases for criminal prosecution. So in places where they have SARTs, there's data that indicates increased reporting, because like Lana said earlier, there's still a lot of victims who don't want to report because they don't trust that anything will happen, and still that's kind of the case, right? So it's important to look at how can a community work together to strengthen cases for criminal prosecution, and this is just one possibility for that to happen. So our initiative can help a tribe develop a SART. Next slide. The other area that we can focus on, the second one, is helping tribes look at developing shelter and safe housing. And we can do that in a number of ways, because, when someone has been, is a victim of domestic violence, for example, there's a critical need for safe housing, for somewhere to go. Having a roof over your head is really important, a basic need that victims of domestic violence, stand in need of. And if they're not able to live in their home, they need to have safe housing. What happens in most tribal communities right now is that tribes have to rely on non-tribal resources. They have to send they're victims of domestic violence off reservation and into, local towns or local cities to be able to obtain safe housing or safe shelter. And it just doesn't seem to be working well because a lot of them are distances away. They're not culturally appropriate. They oftentimes are full, and so it becomes problematic. So it's really important that tribes look at the possibility of developing a community-based domestic violence shelter and also safe housing. Next slide. So that's one of the training and technical assistance that our initiative and our partners can provide. We have on our team people who work out of shelters that are located in tribal communities. And so they have a wealth of experience in how they develop their shelters. They have sample protocols and policies and even the forms that they've already developed that they can utilize in providing training and technical assistance. So we're at an advantage in that fashion that we have partners that are available to provide that type of training in order to assist tribal governments and communities to develop a shelter and also to sustain it. Sustainability is really huge, right? You develop something and you want to be able to have it for a long term. So that's also one of the areas that we look at in terms of how can a community sustain these services once they're developed. So we also have some resources in that sense as well. So we try to, and these are the three areas or the two areas that we are focusing on, and Lana will take you into the next one.
Thank you, Bonnie. Next slide. So we have three focus areas that we're exclusively focusing on, and it doesn't mean that we can't provide training and technical assistance or resources outside of these focus areas, but primarily we're focused on these because of the partnerships that we have, but also understanding that these are critical building pieces that need to be in place in order to provide safety for Native women and their children. So one of the other areas is a focus on the legal response and specifically tribal protection orders. So we have a number of jurisdictions that are public law 280 and also non-public law 280 states and tribes within those states that really are looking to have their tribal protection orders either enforced or recognized. And so, if you look through the federal definitions of tribal protection orders, we're listed under foreign, which I always think is an interesting term because so are other countries such as Canada. So when they're looking at our tribal protection orders, whether it's county, state, or federal, they're really recognizing a foreign order. And so that process is not always as seamless as it should be for victims. And so we find that sometimes victims may have difficulty having their tribal order enforced when they cross a state line, or when they cross a county line, or when they leave the reservation community, or when they travel from one reservation community to another. And there are a number of issues of why that could be. And so we have a partnership with the Tribal Justice Institute, located out of the University of North Dakota, and Michelle Rivard Parks, along with Judge B.J. Jones, who provide this type of assistance to look at all of those multi-jurisdictional responses to the tribal order, and understand why it's not being enforced, understand what the process is for it to be enforced, for your tribal order to be enforced, but also to recognize what is a valid order that would be recognized in that state or federal system. Next slide. So we have understandings that have to do with enforcement of full faith and credit. And this really comes down to, do we have a means to protect Native women and children, whether it's a non-Native offender, an offender, a tribal member of that tribe, or anyone else. A tribal order is a civil order, so tribal court orders can be issued, but they also need to be enforced across those jurisdictions. So this is really looking at the very baseline of safety. If we're, issuing orders out of our tribal court, we want to ensure that they're being recognized across county, federal, and state lines. And so this is an opportunity for tribes to receive free training and technical assistance, exclusively focusing on tribal protection orders. Next slide. So we mentioned those three focus areas, the coordinated community response, along with the sexual assault response teams that Bonnie would be providing training and technical assistance on. We also have the shelter and safe homes, tribal shelters and tribal safe homes. And it's important to say tribal shelter and tribal safe homes only because there are a number of safe homes and shelters that are located outside of the tribal jurisdictions. However, we find that when they're located in tribal jurisdictions or understand how to work with our Native women to ensure that they're comfortable, they're safe, and that we're not in any way jeopardizing their safety by, putting them at risk of, asking them to leave the shelter because of, a schedule or chores or things like that, that we're really ensuring her safety. We find that when working with our tribal shelters and safe homes, that they really can provide that baseline of safety, but also cultural response. And then our legal response pertaining to tribal protection orders. In addition to that, we have a number of resources that are focused exclusively on the areas that we talked about, including advocacy. And it's important to note that advocacy, again, as Bonnie mentioned, is not an advocate located in a prosecutor's office, although that is an advocate, or an advocate that's located in law enforcement, although that is an advocate. We're really looking at community advocacy only because they may have the opportunity to provide confidential and information sharing that protects the victim first and foremost. Those advocates that are located in law enforcement and or located in the prosecutor's office may not always have that as the first and foremost safety precaution because they're focused on prosecution, whereas our community advocates are focused on safety first and foremost. So you can visit our website. Again, it's listed here, and understand and learn more about each of the resources that we provide on these specific areas. And then we also have resources that we provide through the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. Next slide. So the Tribal Law and Policy Institute that Bonnie and I work for, as well as Marlon, who is on this call, we have a number of resources that we have worked with tribes throughout the 20-some years that we have been in existence. We really focus on sovereignty as the first and foremost, to understand that we are not experts in your tribe, that you really bring that expertise, but we do provide resources that are focused on tribal laws. As you see here, the Tribal Law and Order Act, Enhanced Sentencing, and Violence Against Women Act, Enhanced Jurisdiction, drafting or revising victim-centered tribal laws against domestic violence, or We also have a recent resource, which is the Tribal Domestic Violence Courts and Tribal Domestic Violence Court dockets. You can find all of this information by clicking on this web link below, or visit our website at www.tlpihome.org. I hope I listed that right.
Home.tlpi.org. That is
okay.
www.home.tlpi, Tribal Law Policy Institute.org.
Thank you, Marlon. Next slide. So we have a number of ways that you can request training and technical assistance. One is clicking on this link or sending us an email. Both my email as well as Bonnie's email and or the initiative email, the tribal response at tlpi.org, goes to all of our service providers to request training and technical assistance. Or we also have a request form. And I'll turn that over to Marlon to show you that link.
Thank you so much. As you all might note, there are a couple of attachments in the handout section of this webinar. If you click on the expansion folder of that section, there is a document called t.ta.flyer.pdf, and that will take you to the requesting assistance section of our website, tribalresponse.org. And if you're unable to click the handout and or would like a direct address for the form, it is found at www.tribalresponse.org/request-form. If you have any other questions, as Lana and Bonnie had mentioned, their contact information is listed in this PowerPoint presentation. And just before we close up, just send a note that we will also be sending a link to this webinar to all the attendees, in addition to our 3 attachments found in this broadcast. Back to Lana.
Thank you, Marlon. So we have a number of opportunities coming up in 2020 to provide training and technical assistance to tribes. So I would encourage each of you to get your requests in to us, or if you just have questions and may wonder if we can answer those questions or provide any response or direct you to resources, booklets, information, videos. You can also email us, or if you have a question, if your tribe is funded through the Office on Violence Against Women, we can also answer that question as well. So right now we'll open it up for any questions, and if we do not have any questions, we will close this webinar.
There are no questions submitted via the chat function and or the questions, and there are no hand raised to ask a question over the line.
Great. Thank you so much. So I want to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to email us or visit our website at www.tribalresponse.org. Or give us a call at 651-644-1145. We appreciate your time and your attention for this important issue in all of our communities, and each one of you that are affected by this issue. We think of you and know that, each one of us is understanding and will and can respond, hopefully with information, resources, materials, or answer any questions that you may have. Thank you all very much.
There is one question, actually, a last-minute question, and the question is, we recently received OVC funding. I know you mentioned limited assistance. How limited will your assistance be?
So if you receive OVC funding and do not receive OVW funding, we can take a look at your request. We can provide training and technical assistance to you if you do not receive OVW funding. And when I say limited, it just means that we have limited opportunities with the funding that we have available, but we have unlimited opportunities to provide training and technical assistance over the phone, online, or direct you to resources. The limited opportunities are really focused on the training and on-site that would be located in your tribe directly, but we have unlimited opportunities and resources if you give us a call, email us, or visit our website and request information.
One question. Could you explain the difference between OVC and OVW?
Sure. So this initiative is funded through the Office on Violence Against Women, exclusively focused on in the areas of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, as well as stalking and sex trafficking. And these are all under the Department of Justice. We also have the Office on Victims of Crime, or Office for Victims of Crime, which is the OVC funding. So if anybody's familiar with the CTAS, the Coordinated Technical Assistance, and I can never remember what the S is for, but CTAS, CTAS, has 10 purpose areas that they provide tribal funding for, anywhere from the COPS office providing funding through the Bureau of Justice Administration, to violence against women, to children witnessing violence or children in child protective systems, ICW or ICWA, to areas that are focused on youth, youth prevention, youth interventions. So there are 10 purpose areas that is provided through the Office on Victims of Crime. So that's one kind of small piece of the funding. OVC also oversees the funding streams for victim compensation. So if you've heard of in your state Victims of Crime Act or VOCA funding, that is exclusively victim compensation that would be administered through your state. Although recently we have received a large funding stream to administer to tribes, and that is through the OVC Tribal Set-Aside, or Office of Victims of Crime Tribal Set-Aside. And so there is funding available through OVC to address not just the sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, and dating violence, but also looking at general crimes such as homicide, murder, arson, robbery, theft, identity theft, as well as other areas that are affecting Indian country due to opioid epidemics or domestic violence or sexual assault rates, stalking or dating violence. So I would say that the main difference is really that there is probably a little more leeway within the Office of Victims of Crime to look at more general crimes versus the OVW funding that really focuses exclusively on violence against Native women, and specifically in those purpose areas or sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, and dating violence that we are focused on.
Hi, Vana. Correction on the CTAS acronym. It stands for Coordinated Tribal Assistance Solicitation, and under the Department of Justice. And lastly, there's one other last question. How can a full faith and credit help a human trafficking survivor or victim?
I'm going to refer that question to my colleague Bonnie, who works on sex trafficking and human trafficking. Bonnie, do you have a response?
Well, there should be full faith and credit provided within all jurisdictions. And of course, we all know that's not always the case. In order to apply for a protection order, the relationship has to be an intimate one. And oftentimes, jurisdictions run into all sorts of, conflicts and so forth. And in, validating or confirming that, the perpetrator is an intimate partner. So if they share a dwelling, of course, many sex trafficking victims do share a dwelling with their trafficker, and oftentimes the victim may even see the trafficker as an intimate partner because that's part of the grooming process. So in their eyes, of course, they, want, if they're able to escape the trafficking situation and want protection, then they're going to file for a protection order. But a lot of jurisdictions, from what I'm seeing and hearing, have some issues with identifying traffickers as intimate partners. That's one problem. And in general, anyone who is securing a protection order is covered under full faith and credit. So all jurisdictions are supposed to enforce one another's protection orders if they are qualified. And that's where the loophole often is in terms of, with any kind of protection order to, oftentimes jurisdictions will say we can't order that, we can't enforce that order because it's, it's not a qualifying order based on our rules, our guidelines. So that's the problem that you run into. So, I think right now there's a lot of work being done to ensure that protection orders are quote unquote qualifying, and to make them all sort of universal so that victims in particular, don't run into that problem. But yes, it's something that happens, as far as getting protection orders to be enforced under full faith and credit. It's a challenge for anyone in particular with sex trafficking victims.
Thank you so much for all the information that's been shared. If anyone has any other questions, just as a friendly reminder, Lana can be reached at Lonna, Lonna, at tlpi.org, and Bonnie can be reached at Bonnie, Bonnie, at tlpi.org.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marlon. Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you to all of our participants.
Yes, thank you all for joining. And thank you, Marlon, Lana.